Welcome to HOA Rulebook. The board picked the wrong week to play games. That salt is not approved and you are going to be billed for replacement. I stopped mid-shovel and stared at Shirley Turner, the welcome committee chair for Silver Slush Court HOA, standing on my cleared sidewalk in Oklahoma City with a clipboard tucked under one arm and that portable folding sign stand she dragged everywhere like a battle flag. She had just yelled at me that the sidewalk in front of my home failed the HOA standard and she was issuing a fine and adding a reinspection charge. A fresh snowstorm had dropped 8 inches overnight, the city had called a snow emergency, and I had spent 2 hours clearing my walk and driveway before my morning service calls. I work as a pool service technician, and even in winter I handle equipment checks and emergency repairs for commercial accounts. My disabled sibling relies on my vehicle access, and a tow would be a crisis. Shirley planted herself at the curb like she owned the pavement, pointing at the ice melt I had spread to keep the concrete safe. "That is calcium chloride," I said. "Standard hardware store ice melt." "What is the problem?" She flipped a page on her clipboard and jabbed a gloved finger at a line I could not read from where I stood. The approved product list was updated at the January board meeting. You signed the covenants. Now you live the covenants. This product damages the stamped concrete aggregate, and you are responsible for replacement costs. I glanced at my car parked on the street because the driveway was still a solid sheet of ice under a thin scrape layer. A bright orange windshield sticker that says violation without readable details was already plastered across the driver's side glass. She must have slapped it on before she even knocked. I felt my jaw tighten. I had not received any notice about an approved product list. The HOA sent monthly newsletters that were mostly reminders about trash can placement and holiday decoration deadlines, but nothing about ice melt brands. "When was this list published?" I asked. Shirley smiled, the kind of smile that means she thinks she has already won. 2 weeks ago. All residents were notified via the community portal in the January meeting minutes. Failure to comply results in a reinspection fee of $75 and material replacement costs. Your car is also parked on the street during a declared snow emergency, which violates the winter parking addendum. We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works. I planted my shovel in the snowbank and pulled my phone out. I opened the HOA portal app and scrolled back through January. There was no approved product list. The meeting minutes were posted, but they were a 2-page summary with half the items listed as tabled or under review. Nothing about ice melt. I turned the screen toward her. "There is nothing here about an approved list," I said. "Where is the actual document?" She waved a hand like I was wasting her time. "The compliance binder is available for review at the clubhouse during business hours. You are responsible for knowing the rules. Your vehicle needs to be moved within the hour or I am calling the tow company. You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." I looked past her at the street. A mail carrier was trying to navigate through a snowbank someone had plowed across the sidewalk 2 houses down, dragging a wheeled cart through the slush. The city snow emergency meant no parking on arterial streets, but this was a residential side street inside the neighborhood. The HOA winter parking addendum she kept citing was news to me. I had lived here for 3 years, and every previous winter I had parked on the street during storms without a single complaint. Shirley had been on the board for 6 months, and in that time Silver Slush Court had turned into a master-planned community where the board runs snow patrol after every storm, measuring snowbanks and inspecting shoveling jobs like referees. "What is the fine?" I asked. $200 for unapproved material use, $75 for the reinspection, and if your car is not moved, we add a towing authorization fee of $150. Plus the actual tow cost. I did the math. Over $400 because I shoveled my sidewalk and parked legally during a snowstorm. My hands were numb inside my gloves and my back hurt from 2 hours of shoveling. I wanted to argue, but I also needed to get to work. I had 3 service calls scheduled and the roads were a mess. Shirley was already turning away, dragging her sign stand back toward the curb. "I am moving the car now," I said. but I am filing a formal complaint about this. There was no notice about the product list, and the city's snow emergency does not apply to interior neighborhood streets. She stopped and looked back over her shoulder. File whatever you want. The hearing is in 2 weeks. Bring your complaint to the board meeting and we will add it to the agenda. Maybe. I pulled the orange sticker off my windshield, balled it up and tossed it in the trash can at the curb. Then I got in my car, started the engine, and let it warm up while I scraped the remaining snow off the glass. My sibling was inside the house, and I texted to let them know I was moving the car to the driveway even though it was still slick. I could not risk a tow. Shirley stood on the sidewalk taking photos of my car with her phone. I backed into the driveway, slid a little on the ice, and put the car in park. She walked up to my window and knocked. I rolled it down. What now? You are parked with the rear bumper extending past the property line. That is another violation. You have until end of day to correct it or I am adding it to your notice. I looked in the rear view. The bumper was maybe 2 inches over the sidewalk edge. I closed my eyes and counted to 5. This was not enforcement. This was harassment. Shirley leaned in closer. This is a compliance issue. If you have a problem with the process, take it up with the management company. I am just doing my job. She walked away dragging her sign stand behind her, and I sat there with the engine running and the heat blasting, trying to figure out what just happened. My phone buzzed. It was my first service call asking if I was still coming. I texted back that I was on my way, then pulled out of the driveway and headed for the main road. I had a plan forming, but I needed to get through the day first. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos. By the time I got home that evening, the temperature had dropped and the driveway was a skating rink. I parked on the street again because I did not have a death wish. Shirley's car was gone, but there was a new notice taped to my front door. I pulled it down and read it under the porch light. It was a formal violation summary listing 4 separate charges: unapproved ice melt material, unauthorized street parking during snow emergency, rear bumper encroachment, and failure to remove snow accumulation from the roof eave within 24 hours of the storm. The total fine was $675, due within 10 days, with a hearing date circled in red marker. At the bottom in Shirley's handwriting it said, "You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." I went inside and found my sibling at the kitchen table. They looked up and asked how bad it was. I showed them the notice. They read it and shook their head. "This is insane," they said. "You cleared the walk. You moved the car. What does she want?" "She wants compliance," I said. "Or she wants me gone." I have not figured out which yet. I sat down and opened my laptop. The HOA management company was a regional firm that handled about a dozen neighborhoods in the Oklahoma City metro. I found their contact page and drafted an email. I kept it short. I described the violations, noted that I had received no prior notice about the approved product list or the winter parking rules, and requested copies of the relevant policy documents and meeting minutes. I attached photos of my cleared sidewalk and the violation notice. Then I sent it and hoped for a response within a few days. My sibling asked what I was going to do about the fines. I said I was not paying until I saw proof that the rules existed. They reminded me that the HOA could put a lien on the property if I did not pay. I knew that. I also knew that Shirley was counting on me folding under pressure. She had done this to other people. A neighbor 2 streets over had been fined for parking a work truck in his driveway overnight. Another family got hit with a landscaping violation because their grass was a 1/4 inch too long during a drought. The board minutes were always vague, and the rules seemed to change depending on who Shirley decided to target that week. The next morning I woke up to another snowfall. Not as heavy, maybe 2 inches, but enough to coat everything again. I went out early and cleared the walk before Shirley could show up with her clipboard. I used the same ice melt because I still had half a bag left and I was not buying some mystery-approved brand without seeing the actual list. I moved the car into the driveway, angled it so the bumper was a full foot inside the property line, and took photos with my phone for evidence. Then I shoveled the roof eave, even though it was barely accumulating and the rule about 24-hour removal was something I had never heard of before. At 8 in the morning, Shirley's car pulled up. She got out, walked up my driveway, and stood there with her arms crossed, staring at the sidewalk. I opened the front door and stepped out. She looked at me and frowned. "You use the same product," she said. "I am waiting for the management company to send me the approved list," I said. "I filed a formal request yesterday." "That does not change your obligation. You are in violation again. I am adding another re-inspection fee." She pulled out her phone and took more photos. I pulled out mine and took photos of her taking photos. She noticed and glared. "You cannot intimidate me," she said. "This is a compliance process and it is going to run its course." "I am documenting the process," I said. "Same as you." She turned and walked back to her car, dragging the sign stand through the snow. I watched her leave, then went back inside. My sibling was watching from the window. "She is going to keep doing this until you pay or move," they said. "Probably," I said. "But I am not doing either." I spent the rest of the morning calling the management company. The first 2 times I got voicemail. The third time I got a receptionist who said the compliance coordinator was out until Monday. I left a message with my name, address, and a summary of the issue. Then I called a notary I knew from a previous job, someone who helped me organize sworn statements when I was dealing with a vendor dispute last year. Her name was Angela, and she remembered me. I explained the situation and asked if she could help me organize documentation in case this went to a hearing or beyond. She said yes and asked me to send over everything I had so far. I scanned the notices, the emails, the photos, and my notes. I sent it all to Angela. She called back an hour later and said it looked like the HOA was manipulating minutes and agendas to erase objections after the meeting, which was exactly the tactic I suspected. She said I needed to get copies of the original meeting packets and compare them to the posted minutes. She also said I should check with the city about the snow emergency rules because HOAs love to misrepresent ordinances to make their policies sound official. I called the city public works department and asked about snow emergency parking rules. The clerk I spoke to said the emergency applied only to arterial streets and specifically marked snow routes. Residential streets inside subdivisions were not covered unless they were designated by the city, and Silver Slush Court was not on the list. She offered to send me a written confirmation, and I said yes. She emailed it within 10 minutes. It was a 1-page letter on city letterhead confirming that interior residential streets in my neighborhood were not subject to the snow emergency parking ban. I forwarded it to Angela and to the management company. Then I sat back and waited. The hearing was still 10 days away, but I had a feeling things were going to move faster than that. That afternoon, Shirley showed up again. This time she had a second board member with her, a man in his 50s who I recognized from the annual meeting. His name was Greg, and he was the treasurer. They walked up to my door together and I opened it before they could knock. "We need to talk," Greg said. I stepped out onto the porch. Shirley stood behind him, arms crossed, looking satisfied. "Greg," I said, "what is this about?" He glanced at Shirley, then back at me. "There has been a complaint filed regarding your compliance with snow removal and parking policies. The board takes these matters seriously, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to resolve this before the hearing." "I have already filed a complaint with the management company," I said. "I have not received notice of the approved product list, and the city confirmed that the parking ban does not apply to this street." Greg shifted his weight. Shirley stepped forward. "The parking policy is an HOA rule, not a city rule," she said. "The covenants allow the board to establish parking restrictions for safety and aesthetics. You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." I looked at Greg. He looked uncomfortable. I had a feeling he did not agree with Shirley, but he was not going to say it on the record. That was the side complication I was dealing with. Board members who knew Karen was wrong but refused to say it on the record. It made the process harder because I could not count on internal dissent to slow her down. "I need to see the actual policy," I said, "not a summary." The full text with the approval date and signatures. Greg nodded. "I will make sure it is available at the clubhouse." Shirley cut in. "It is already available. He does not need special access." The compliance binder is open to all residents during business hours. "I am requesting a copy," I said. "Delivered to my home or via email. If this is going to a hearing, I need the documentation." Greg said he would follow up with the management company. Shirley looked annoyed. They left, and I went back inside. My sibling asked what happened. I said Greg was uncomfortable but not willing to fight Shirley, which meant I was on my own unless I could force the issue with evidence. The next day, the management company finally responded. The email was from the compliance coordinator, a woman named Sandra. She said she had reviewed my complaint and the documentation I provided. She confirmed that the approved product list had been discussed at the January meeting, but had not been finalized or published. She said the winter parking policy was part of an older addendum that had been updated in December, and she was attaching a copy. She also said the roof eave snow removal rule was not in the current covenants and appeared to be an error on the notice. She offered to waive the reinspection fees and reduce the fines to a warning if I agreed to use an approved ice melt product going forward. I read the email twice. It was a partial win, but it did not address the fact that Shirley had lied about the timeline and the rules. I wrote back and asked for the full January meeting packet, including any drafts or proposals that were discussed. I also asked for clarification on the winter parking addendum and how it was communicated to residents. Sandra said she would send the packet by end of week. That evening, I got a text from Angela. She had been reviewing the documents I sent and noticed something. The winter parking addendum I received from Sandra had a signature page, but the signature line for the board president was blank. Angela said that meant the policy was never formally approved, which made it unenforceable. She said I should bring it up at the hearing and force the board to explain why they were enforcing a draft policy. I called her and we talked through the strategy. She said I should also request the gate access logs if the neighborhood had a security gate, because those logs would show when Shirley entered the neighborhood and could confirm or disprove her timeline. I told her we did not have a security gate, but we did have a vendor who serviced the neighborhood entrance signs and the clubhouse locks. I remembered seeing a service truck a few weeks back. Angela said I should contact the vendor and ask if they kept entry logs or service records that might show board activity on the day Shirley claimed the parking policy was updated. It was a long shot, but I called the vendor. The company was a local locksmith and gate maintenance service. I explained that I was a resident dealing with an HOA dispute and needed to verify when a policy was approved. The service rep I spoke to said they did not keep logs of board meetings, but they did have a record of service calls to the clubhouse. He offered to send me a summary of dates and times for the past 3 months if I provided a formal request in writing. I sent the request that night. 2 days later, the vendor sent the records. There was a service call to the clubhouse on January 10th to replace a lock on the main entrance. The invoice included a timestamp and a signature from the person who authorized the work. The signature was Greg's. The January board meeting was listed in the HOA calendar as January 15th. That meant Shirley could not have been enforcing a policy approved at the January meeting when she cited me on January 18th, because the meeting happened after the lock service. Something did not line up. I forwarded the invoice to Angela. She called me back within an hour and said I had just found the twist. The policy Shirley was enforcing had never been approved because the meeting where it was supposed to be voted on had not happened yet when she started issuing fines. Angela said that was a smoking gun, but I needed to confirm the actual meeting date with the management company or the posted minutes. I pulled up the community portal and checked. The meeting minutes for January were posted on January 22nd. The meeting date listed at the top was January 15th. That gave me a 4-day window where Shirley was citing a policy that did not exist yet. I called Sandra at the management company and asked her to confirm the date of the January board meeting. She said it was January 15th, and the minutes were approved and posted on the 22nd. I asked her when the winter parking policy was voted on. She put me on hold and came back a few minutes later. She said the policy was tabled at the January meeting and had not been voted on yet. It was still listed as under review. So the policy Shirley cited does not exist, I said. Sandra hesitated. The board may have been operating under the assumption that the policy was in effect pending approval. That is not uncommon. But it is not enforceable, I said. Technically, no. Not until it is formally approved. I need that in writing, I said. She said she would send a clarification email to the board and copy me. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Angela and told her what I had. She said I now had everything I needed for the hearing, but I should hold the vendor invoice and the city letter as a trump card. Do not show them until Shirley commits to her version of events on the record. Let her dig the hole, then bury her with the proof. I walked away on purpose, because I wanted her to follow and say more. That was the plan. Let Shirley escalate, let her double down on the lies, and then hit her with the evidence when she could not walk it back. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the clubhouse. I arrived early with a folder full of documents, the vendor invoice, the city letter, the email from Sandra, and photos of every interaction with Shirley. Angela came with me as a witness. The clubhouse was a small building at the front of the neighborhood with a meeting room and a kitchenette. The board sat at a folding table at the front, Shirley in the middle, Greg to her left, and two other board members I barely knew on the right. There were about a dozen residents in the audience, most of them there for other agenda items. Shirley called the meeting to order and ran through the standard opening. When she got to my item, she read the violation summary out loud, listing all 4 charges and the total fine. Then she asked if I wanted to make a statement. I stood up. I said I was disputing all 4 charges because the policies cited did not exist or were misrepresented. I handed out copies of the city letter confirming that the snow emergency parking ban did not apply to interior streets. I handed out the email from Sandra confirming that the approved ice melt list had not been finalized and the roof eave rule was not in the covenants. Shirley took the papers and barely looked at them. This does not change the fact that you parked in violation of the winter addendum, she said. That policy has been in effect since December. I pulled out the copy of the addendum Sandra had sent me and held up the signature page. The board president's signature line is blank, I said. The policy was never formally approved. It is a draft. Shirley's face went red. Greg leaned over and looked at the signature page. He looked at Shirley. She ignored him. The board operates with the understanding that policies under review are enforceable pending final approval, she said. That is standard procedure. Not according to the management company, I said. I have an email from Sandra stating that unapproved policies are not enforceable. Shirley stood up. You are wasting the board's time with technicalities. The intent of the policy is clear. You parked in violation and you used unapproved materials. The fines stand. I pulled out the vendor invoice and held it up. This is a service record from the locksmith who worked on the clubhouse on January 10th. The January board meeting was on the 15th. You cited me on the 18th for violating a policy that was not approved until after you issued the fine. You enforced a rule that did not exist. The room went silent. Greg stared at the invoice. One of the other board members, a woman in her 60s, leaned forward and asked to see it. I handed it over. Shirley tried to grab it, but the woman held it out of reach and read it carefully. This shows the meeting was on the 15th, the woman said. Shirley, when did you issue the first notice? Shirley sat down. She looked at the table. January 18th, she said quietly. So you cited him 3 days after the meeting, the woman said. Was the parking policy approved at that meeting? Greg flipped through a binder in front of him. It was tabled, he said. We did not vote on it. It is still under review. The woman looked at Shirley. Then the fines are invalid. Shirley slammed her hand on the table. He is manipulating the timeline. The policy was discussed in December. He knew the intent. Intent does not matter, the woman said. Enforcement requires an approved policy. This is basic governance. Shirley stood up again, her face bright red, and pointed at me. You think you are clever. You think you can come in here and embarrass the board with your paperwork and your complaints. You signed the covenants. Now you live the covenants. We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works. Someone in the audience laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh, and it cut through the tension like a blade. Shirley spun around and glared. The room was silent again. I stayed calm. I looked at Greg. I would like to make a formal motion to dismiss all fines and reinspection fees, I said. And I would like the board to explain why the compliance process allowed enforcement of unapproved policies. Greg nodded. I will second that motion. Shirley turned on him. You cannot second it. You are the treasurer. You are supposed to support the board. I am supporting proper procedure, Greg said. This is a governance failure. We need to fix it. The woman on the right raised her hand. I move that we table this item and schedule a special meeting to review the compliance process and the winter policies. All in favor. Greg raised his hand. The fourth board member, a quiet man in his 40s, raised his hand. Shirley sat there with her arms crossed, staring at the table. The motion passed 3-1. Shirley stood up and grabbed her clipboard and her portable folding sign stand. She walked out of the room without another word. The audience started talking all at once. Greg banged a gavel and called for order. He said the special meeting would be scheduled within 2 weeks and notices would be sent to all residents. He adjourned the main meeting, and people started filtering out. Angela came up to me and said I handled it perfectly. She said the vendor invoice was the kill shot, and I timed it exactly right. I thanked her and packed up my folder. Greg walked over and apologized. He said Shirley had been running compliance like a personal fiefdom, and the board had let it slide because she was the only one willing to do the work. He said the special meeting would include a review of all pending fines and a vote on whether to bring in an outside audit of the compliance process. I asked if the fines were dismissed. He said yes, effective immediately. I asked if Shirley was going to face any consequences. He said that was up to the board, but he personally thought she needed to step back from compliance. I left the clubhouse and walked out into the cold. It was snowing again, light flurries that stuck to my jacket and melted on my face. My sibling was waiting in the car, and I got in and told them what happened. They said it sounded like I won. I said maybe, but I had a feeling Shirley was not done yet. I was right. 2 days later, I was at the grocery store loading bags into my car when Shirley pulled into the parking spot next to me. She got out, dragging her sign stand, and walked up to my cart. I stopped and looked at her. She looked furious. You think you humiliated me, she said. You think you won. I think the board dismissed the fines, I said. That is all I wanted. You went to the management company. You filed a complaint. You are trying to get me removed. I filed a complaint about improper enforcement, I said. That is not the same thing. She stepped closer. You do not understand how this works. The HOA is a volunteer organization. People like me keep it running. Without us, this neighborhood falls apart. You do not get to waltz in with your paperwork and your tricks and tear it down. I am not tearing anything down, I said. I am asking for basic fairness. If you cannot enforce policies correctly, maybe you should not be in charge of enforcement. She screamed. It was loud enough that people in the parking lot turned to look. She screamed that I was a liar and a troublemaker and I was going to regret going after her. She said she had friends on the board and in the management company and she would make sure I never had a moment of peace in Silver Slush Court. She said she would find every violation, every technicality, every mistake I made, and she would bury me in fines until I moved out. A store employee walked over and asked if everything was okay. Shirley ignored him. I pulled out my phone and started recording. She saw the phone and lunged for it. I stepped back and kept recording. The employee stepped between us and told Shirley she needed to calm down or he would call the police. She grabbed her sign stand and stormed back to her car, yelling that this was not over. I sent the video to Angela and to Sandra at the management company. Angela called me an hour later and said the video was gold. She said Shirley had just confessed to retaliatory enforcement on camera, which was a violation of the management contract and potentially actionable under harassment laws. She said I should file a complaint to the management company that triggers discipline and let them handle it from there. I wrote the complaint that night. I included the video, the timeline of fines, the evidence of unapproved policy enforcement, and a statement that Shirley had admitted in the parking lot to targeting me for retaliation. I sent it to Sandra and copied the board. Sandra responded the next morning and said she was forwarding the complaint to the regional manager and recommending an immediate review of Shirley's role. The special board meeting happened a week later. I did not attend, but Greg called me afterward and told me what happened. The board voted to suspend Shirley from the compliance committee pending an external audit of all fines issued in the past 6 months. They also voted to adopt a new policy requiring all enforcement actions to be reviewed by the management company before fines were issued. Greg said Shirley tried to defend herself, but when another board member asked her to explain the timeline discrepancy on the record, she refused and walked out. Someone asked for her motion on record, and she had nothing. The audit took 3 weeks. The management company hired an outside consultant to review the compliance process. The consultant found that Shirley had issued over 40 fines in 6 months, and more than half of them were based on policies that were either unapproved, misrepresented, or applied inconsistently. The consultant recommended that all fines issued under Shirley's authority be reviewed and refunded where appropriate. The board voted to accept the recommendation. 32 fines were reversed, including all of mine. The total refunds came to over $15,000. The city also got involved. Someone, I never found out who, filed a complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office about the HOA misrepresenting the snow emergency ordinance in writing. The city sent an investigator who reviewed the notices in the winter parking policy. The investigator issued a written warning to the HOA for interfering with public right-of-way access and misrepresenting city policy. The board was required to send a correction notice to all residents and update the covenants to remove any reference to city snow emergency rules. The investigator also noted that the HOA snow patrol practice of measuring shoveling jobs and issuing fines for minor accumulation was not supported by any city code, and recommended that the policy be revised to focus on genuine safety hazards only. The board held a vote at the next regular meeting. The winter parking policy was scrapped entirely. The approved ice melt list was dropped. The roof eave snow removal rule was removed from all notices. The compliance process was restructured to require pre-approval from the management company for any fine over $50. Shirley resigned from the welcome committee and the board the day after the vote. I heard from a neighbor that she moved out of Silver Slush Court 2 months later. Greg became the new board president. He reached out to me and apologized again for how the whole situation had been handled. He said the board was committed to rebuilding trust with residents and making sure compliance was fair and transparent. I told him I appreciated it, and I hoped the changes stuck. He said they would. The funny thing is, after everything, I actually started going to board meetings. Not to cause trouble, just to keep an eye on things. Angela came with me a few times. We met other residents who had been fined under Shirley's regime, and we helped them get their money back. The neighborhood calmed down. People still shoveled their walks and moved their cars during storms, but nobody was running around with clipboards and stopwatches anymore. The compliance process got audited and cleaned up, just like it should have been from the start. And Shirley's timeline was proven false with timestamps, which meant her entire case collapsed under its own weight. I still live in Silver Slush Court. My sibling still relies on my vehicle access, and now I can park wherever I need to without worrying about a tow. The driveway is still a pain in the winter, but I handle it. I use whatever ice melt I want. Nobody measures my shoveling job. And if I see a bright orange windshield sticker that says violation without readable details, I know exactly what to do. I document it. I call the management company, and I let the process work the way it is supposed to. That is how you beat an HOA Karen. You do not fight dirty. You do not break the rules. You just hold them to their own standards and watch them fold when the proof comes out. I will see you in the next upload.